Welcome to Full Press, a media criticism podcast where you can escape the echo chambers of the mainstream media for a precious 40 minutes every 2 weeks. As always, I am joined by Tara Henley and Peter Menzies, and I am Harrison Lohman, managing editor of The Hub. Tara, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, thanks.
How are you doing, Peter? I feel like you've been gallivanting around. I've been creeping you on Facebook and seeing you in mountains and fields, etc.
I was actually in Ottawa and Gatineau.
Ottawa sounds boring. Gatineau sounds less boring. So you're rested. Both of you feel rested, or are you still slogging through a trade war, an upcoming federal election? How are you feeling?
I'm high on caffeine.
Are you? What about you, Peter? Something a little bit more...
Well, I'm a little sleepy this morning. I had a late arrival with my flight last night. I mean, it was on time, but it was an evening flight, and it's a long flight from Ottawa to Calgary.
So I mentioned an election is coming. An election is coming. We have a new Liberal leader, and we might have a new prime minister in the next few days, a man by the name of Mark Carney, former central banker. I'm wondering just initially what you guys think of his relationship so far with the media. Peter, let's start with you. How would you describe that relationship?
I would say that he has controlled the media very effectively, and the media seems very comfortable with that.
What about you, Tara?
I would agree with that. I think it's pretty disappointing how little access journalists have had to Mark Carney, considering he's about to be our prime minister. I think the message that he has sent so far is that not only is he unelected, but he's also unaccountable.
Oh, man, that's pretty... Okay, so let's get into some of this. I want to touch, I guess, first on, you mentioned reporters being kicked out. We had two instances of this. One was, I think, at his launch event, Peter, right? A reporter at the Western Standard who actually does have press gallery credentials at the Alberta legislature was kicked out, along with some other characters that, you might be able to debate further about, if they are actually journalists. But this happened again after these folks had been, sent emails and invited to another one of his events. What did you make of what happened? And I heard you sent a fiery response after you found out that folks had been left at the door.
Well, I thought it was very disappointing. Again, it was the reporter who was banned, comes from Western Standard. His name is Sean Polzer. Sean used to work for the Calgary Herald. So it's not like he just popped up out of nowhere. Or lacks credibility, street creds as a journalist. So the biggest disappointment isn't so much that they did it; it's that nobody very few people anyway in the Canadian media industry seem to care. The Canadian Associations of Journalists, I mean, the last time they threw out a tweet and that was it. This time, nothing. So you can't call yourselves defenders of democracy and not defend it. It's very irritating to see that end of things, and I think they've sent a message that Mark Carney can pick and choose whatever journalists he wants, just the way Donald Trump has been doing.
See, okay, I'm going to argue with you here, Peter, because it's my belief that it's more his team than him. Because I remember a few years ago, him at the WEF in Davos, he was chased down by rebel reporters, and he happily spoke to them for 10, 15 minutes. And he said things like freedom of the press, you got to answer tough questions. You ask tough questions, that's fair. He met criticism sort of head on there and was willing to chat. And in some ways, I found it cleared the air because these guys couldn't say, you're holding us back, you're not letting us talk to you, you're not letting yourself be criticized, you're this invisible banker that is an elite and so above us. Do you really, Tara, what do you think? Do you think it's him or his handlers that are doing this?
Well, I don't know. I really don't know. But I will say I'm pretty sure that the most recent Davos gathering, reporters did chase him down and he wouldn't give interviews on the street. So I'm not sure what his motivations are. I can't speculate on what's going on inside his head. But I do know that the facts are that Canadian journalists have next to no access to the man who will be leading our country.
This is the thing. It's one thing if you're a Liberal leader and, you have these private events run by the party. It's another thing when you're the guy running the show, you're a G7 leader, you're spending millions of people's money. You're supposed to be accountable. You're supposed to be responsible, and you're coming after a government which had a series of ethical lapses. So, Peter, what do you think? Now that he's prime minister, do you think things will get better, or will be more of the same?
Well, as soon as he becomes, yes, now that he is prime minister, I don't see any reason to, I have no reason to believe that it would change because, like I said, it's worked for them so far. If it's his team making the calls, well, I mean, who's in charge there? Is the team in charge or is he in charge, right? Usually, if it's his team, he should be in charge. But it also indicates that his team doesn't think he's very good at it. So they don't want him to answer questions like that. But I would say he would probably continue to be remote and aloof and uh, elite because that's what's working for him.
He said the other day to reporters, in I think one of his first scrums as prime minister designate, that you'll probably be seeing more of me than you'd like, and it'll be interesting to see if that's the case. I've never heard journalists say we see this prime minister way too much. We'd like less access. But there's other issues here too, right, guys? Like, and Peter, you've brought this up in your Substack. His place at Brookfield and whether. Were you still the chair when the company decided to move its headquarters to New York? What we find out after he, pushes this issue aside is that the board voted unanimously in favor of the move. While Carney was chair, he issued a letter to shareholders, approving of the proposals, but I think it went through after he left. Right, Peter? The whole thinking here being you're not doubling down in Canada if you agree to move the headquarters of a company to the U.S. How do you think that affair went, Peter?
I think that's very awkward for him, and I think he handled it very, very badly because when he first addressed the issue, he didn't tell the truth, and that was a problem. An even bigger problem is that his team or him, they just let it go. It's still sitting out there. It's unaddressed. Like it's perfectly sensible for somebody to say, I didn't phrase that properly. I was trying to say something I'm not used to, and I said the wrong thing, and I'm sorry. I will do better in the future, and I will take the time to think before I speak, and move on from there. But the fact that they just decided to bury it, and again, everybody seems to have gone along with that. Okay, you want to bury it, we'll bury it. Is I think kind of alarming.
Mm-hmm. Is putting everything out in the open the best medicine always in politics, Tara? What do you think?
I don't know if it's the best medicine in politics, but as a journalist, I would certainly encourage that strategy.
Because he's still, I'll just raise this as well, and there's other sides to this, but he says, I've resigned all my positions, full stop, early on. Yet the National Post finds out he's still president of Chatham House, board at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. They contacted all these places on the advisory board of the Vatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, chair of Group of 30, and potentially a member at the Harvard University Board of Overseers. That's a mouthful, I know. He was doing a lot, obviously. Like, he was to be on all these boards. Rubber will really hit the road, folks, now that, he's spoken to the ethics commissioner. The problem is that I don't know if we get those results, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, until after a potential election, right? It takes months to sort through this stuff. Is there an issue with the timeline there in terms of us getting full answers, as Canadians make their decision about whether this is their guy, this is the guy they want leading them through the next trade war?
Yeah, they finally came out yesterday and had a news release saying that everything had been put into a blind trust and that they'd conducted been in touch with the ethics commissioner, and which is nice. Again, he didn't say it. It was a statement issued to the press, so there could be no questions asked in terms of that. But you're dead right in terms of the process. I've been through it in my time at the CRTC, and it takes a little while. It doesn't have to take months. It depends what else they've got going on, but I'm pretty sure this goes to the top of the in basket, and any adjustments that need to be made can be made quickly. Whether you get that result before an election call or not, I don't know that that's possible because there's in terms of the formality of it. But I don't see that as being a huge thing. But again, I think it would be very good for the public to know. They have a right to know what those associations are and have been, et cetera, when you're the prime minister.
I think the biggest thing here too, guys, is like this is pretty unprecedented in that he's never been elected, and that given that he's new here, he came into politics so fast, and suddenly he's got the biggest job in Canadian politics. That there should be potentially a higher standard, right? Whether it's real conflict of interest or perceived conflict of interest, that he should go above and beyond to assure us that, listen, there's no foul play here, and here are my connections to this person in this organization. I will say at the same time, I'm interested in your view on this, Tara. I don't think the Conservatives help. I don't think it's intelligent criticism when the criticism comes in the form of the press releases I receive from them, which is sneaky carbon tax Carney, that he's this like Grinch-like figure lurking in the caves and can't be trusted in the name calling. I don't know, maybe I need to get with the times, but what do you make of that approach to all this, that when met with all these questions about his associations, you get sneaky Carney on a news release?
I don't think it's very serious rhetoric, and I don't think it's the way to go at all. This is a very serious issue. We have someone who has not been elected by the Canadian public who is now leading the country. That's a very serious issue, and I think it should be treated with serious language and serious rhetoric. There's enough already to criticize. You don't have to go over the top with your rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. Peter, what do you think?
I think I'm not a political expert, but that sort of phraseology doesn't really work for me. But I'm pretty sure I'm not the target audience for that.
That's true.
Yeah, the things that get me about the media is like we haven't talked about is Carney's a Catholic. He's a big time Catholic. He goes to mass every week. Andrew Scheer was hounded for weeks about his personal views on abortion. Even though he made clear what his public view was. Nobody's even asked him about being a Catholic, what his views are on MAID or other, issues that may be in conflict with Catholic teaching.
I thought it was interesting.
It amazes me that one just went right by everybody.
Although he did mention going to church in his speech. But like you said, given that, given the previous administration was pretty, they were emphatic. Like Trudeau said, if you are not pro-choice, you are not a member of this Liberal Party. So, yeah, I think that those are fair questions that hopefully will be coming up in the many press conferences that he will be hosting in coming days. Tara, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, to Peter's point, I did see reporting this morning from the Catholic Register saying that Carney was actually part of a council at the Vatican. So I have not had time to look into that yet, but I do think that's interesting as well in terms of his associations and everything. That's something that should be on the public record.
Is there a board that this guy is not on, whether it's in Vatican City or New York or, oh my gosh, he's so busy, my Lord. Speaking of, important people, I wanted to talk a little bit about Jeff Bezos, who is the owner of Amazon, a billionaire, also the owner of the Washington Post, which has been going through it for some time. I'm going to call this segment a bulletin from a billionaire. Because we got Bezos coming out the other day. Keep in mind, folks, this is after years of the Washington Post being very anti-Trump, their op-eds, leaning left, going after Trump, the slogan "Democracy dies in darkness" prominently displayed at the top of their website. And then Bezos comes out and he says, we are going to be changing our opinion pages. We're going to be writing every day in support and defense of two pillars, personal liberties and free markets. We'll cover other topics too, of course, but viewpoints opposing those pillars will be left to be published by others. There was a time when a newspaper, especially one that was a local monopoly, might have seen it as a service to bring to readers' doorsteps every morning a broad-based opinion section that sought to cover all views. Today, the internet does that job. cue resignations of people who've been working for the Washington Post for 40 years and more than 75,000 digital subscribers canceling their subscriptions in 48 hours. Tara, what did you make of this bulletin? Does it trouble you? Do you think, it's nothing special? Should we be concerned or not?
Well, like many stories, this story is developing as we are taping today. So this morning we saw Ruth Marcus, the Washington Post columnist who'd been with the Post for 41 years, publish a long piece in the New Yorker about her decision to resign. It was around a column that was spiked by the Post. She, to her credit, published the column as well in the New Yorker.
And the column said what?
And the column was very actually inoffensive. It was talking about a plurality of views and like basic journalistic principles. And I think that's how we have to approach this story. Like this story with the Post goes back a little bit to when they spiked the editorial in favor of Kamala Harris.
Yeah, endorsing her.
Yes. So I supported that decision. I don't think newspapers gain anything by being openly partisan in that way. And now we've also seen Bezos making overtures to Trump. I don't think that's healthy for the newsroom either. And now we have this editorial edict that it has to be one view that is expressed in an editorial section. So those of us that, argued in 2020 that we need diversity of thought, that we shouldn't just have one perspective, aired out in the public square, should now, I think, argue the same point in regards to this situation. It is not healthy, as David Brooks said, I think yesterday or the day before, to have an opinion section that doesn't brook dissent. The whole point is open debate, is giving the public a range of views and all the information so that they can make their own decisions about this.
Peter, what do you think about this? Is it fair for him to do this, given that he's the owner, or are you deeply troubled by this and, rattling in your your bones rattling? Are you concerned?
Well, he is the owner and he can do whatever he wants. And if he's that keen on free markets and he loses 75,000 subscribers, then the market has spoken, right? So you pay your money and you take your chances.
Peter's used to an olden age because people think this is new. There was an olden age. I'm not calling you old, Peter. You're wise, okay? But there's a time when newspaper barons used their newspapers to vocalize their views. It was like a soapbox, for them to do what they wanted. And you best believe, even more recently, that behind closed doors, like there are strings being pulled by owners now and then.
Of course, but the general principle still stands that if we want to argue for an independent press that insulates itself from power, and that's the argument we make about the subsidies in Canada, right? I think the same thing then applies to this scenario, that the Washington Post is not insulating itself from power and is compromising its independence.
Mm-hmm. You talk about compromise. For me, I think they're going to lose even more viewers, because it's not just a little course correction. It's a huge pivot. As I said, this was a newspaper that was leaning left in its editorials, was going after Trump. Marty Barron, you and I went to that talk. Mm-hmm. He was the former executive editor of the Washington Post, and he told us, we asked him, I said, how many conservative readers do you have? He said it's in the single digits. So those are the pool of readers that they have to draw from when it comes to making this pivot. They're going to have to get a lot of new readers if they want to do this.
But again, back to the bigger conversation, too, about objectivity in journalism. Thomas Chatterton Williams, a writer that I really respect, had this great tweet this week. I'm going to read it to you both. I'm old enough to remember that some of us tried to warn the left that it was an unwise precedent to set when, for example, the former executive editor of the Post, Leonard Downey Jr., embraced his former employee, Wesley Lowery's short-sighted notion that newsrooms should move beyond objectivity. So again, this is stuff that's been debated forever. It's just the power center has flipped now. And if we disagreed with it before, we should disagree with it now.
At the same time, though, Peter, this is an op-ed page. It's one thing if he's saying all the reporting's got to be skewed towards this stuff. Are these not two separate things? And, the op-ed section is one thing and reporting something else. What do you make of the whole objectivity argument?
Well, I think unless you have a conflict of views, unless you have a variety of views, I think you're just boring. You become a sort of a, it is. I mean, who needs to open an op-ed page and read 3 or 4 pieces by conservatives agreeing with you? It'd be like watching the CBC at issue panel where everybody just says, "Oh, I agree," right? Yes, you're right. You're so clever, blah, 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 right? And it just goes back and forth. It's an echo chamber. It's boring. So same on the left. If it's just, you know, 4 Rick Salutins every day, then it's boring. So if you want to actually engage people and you want to give them what they want is a variety of views, and then from which they can develop their own, you should have a variety of views.
Also, how do you measure this? I just imagine there's some sort of meter in the newsroom that every editor's got to like, I don't know, compare the piece to and say, well, you have to mention freedom at least 5 times each article, and we have to do this and carry the 5. Like, how do you go about doing this? It's so subjective, Tara.
Well, this is the other problem that Ruth Marcus got at in her editorial and in her piece for the New Yorker is like, what does this actually mean in practical terms, and how is this to be interpreted by columnists? It's going to have a huge chilling effect, because when you don't know where the line is, you steer well clear of it.
It's also like, it's one thing if it was genuine, but it's clearly him moving alongside the other tech, so-called oligarchs in, bowing down before Trump, showing their fealty. It's like a blatant public intervention that has him sidling up next to, he's next in line after Zuckerberg and Elon. Elon's actually might be genuine. I think he believes everything he does. But it's just, I don't know. I don't know how real it all is. Does it seem real to you, Peter?
I feel like I'm living in a world of Bond villains and Marvel comic characters. It's quite bizarre, but it's sort of like everybody's $1 billion. It's quite creepy in that regard.
I like the Mike Myers reference. He's been fighting for Canada lately. I don't know if you guys are watching SNL and his elbows up move that he's been making as he plays Elon. Oh my gosh, there's so many connections here.
I have a question about SNL. Is it actually funny?
Do you? Well, I don't know, Peter. Is SNL funny anymore? I don't really think so.
I don't think so. I was staying with my sister, so I watched it there. That's probably the first time I've watched it in at least 10 years, I guess. Partly because, as you noted, I'm kind of elderly now, so I don't stay up that late on a Saturday night.
Well, this is what I was going to say.
If I do, I'm watching a hockey game.
Peter's showing his age because he's still doing appointment television and watching it literally on Saturday night, live. He's watching it live. Whereas Tara and I are kicking our feet up on Monday, pulling out a YouTube video, etc.
Did I tell you I don't watch cable? That makes me a bit more of a hipster, right?
Peter also doesn't.
Are you still plugged in, Harrison?
No, I've left.
Come on, man, get with it.
I know. I think Peter's living in a blissful world because he doesn't pay attention to America too much. So, but in doing so, he can, remain blissfully unaware of the trade war and potential incoming invasion. And you're probably leading a much less stressful life than Tarn, I hear, Peter.
Well, also, there's a matter of bandwidth. I don't know about you, Harrison, but I find it pretty hard keeping up with politics in this country and in the U.S. If you just focused on Canada, you probably have a much deeper knowledge, Peter. Peter, do you think that's true? I try to avoid things that I can't do anything about. And actually, there's probably very little I can do about anything. But I think there's a difference in Toronto. I think Toronto faces south, and so it sees things south. I always notice that. Whereas here in Calgary and Edmonton or whatever, we tend to look more east and west. I mean, some of it's geographic because if we face south, there's only Montana. It's not like there's any big American cities to the south. There's a pretty clear channel all the way down to Salt Lake City is the next big city. So I think it's just a culture thing and a geographical thing. But I do pay attention to Americans when they want to kill me. But
okay,
otherwise, I generally don't follow their politics too much.
I want to jump on you potentially being killed by some sort of I'm kidding, of course, but I wanted to introduce this issue because I'm interested in your guys' take on it. There's a debate in newsrooms now about how seriously we take these threats from Trump. Are they rhetoric? Is there something to them? You saw in the New York Times the other day talk of, this was actually being discussed, Canada being kicked out of the Five Eyes, rethinking treaties as it relates to Great Lakes, that the border should be moved, that he's talking about the border being moved. You don't hear about invasion in terms of soldiers, but I'm just wondering, like, it is of course the incentive to have a military expert write about what an insurgency would look like in Canada, what an invasion would look like, what it would look like if we went to war. You want those eyeballs. You can imagine how well those articles do, and they are doing well. At the same time, I wonder if we're, giving this thing fuel, and maybe we shouldn't be entertaining these ideas, given that they may just be bluster. Anyway, I've been trying to sort through this week, Tara, and I'm wondering what you think. By talking about whether it's Canada being invaded literally by soldiers in the U.S., again, it seems crazy just to say out loud, or talking about how Canada, like the dissolution of Canada and how it could be broken down and swallowed by the U.S., just literally by putting those opinions on our opinion pages, telling reporters to report on what this would look like, speaking to experts, that, is that ridiculous and feeding the fire, or is it warranted and, informing the population about something that actually could happen, or that, the president is saying could happen?
Well, this has been very much on my mind because I'm writing my book right now about trust in the media, and a lot of it has to do with the way that the media reacted last time Donald Trump was president. And I think the lessons from that first presidency apply here, which is, yes, you have to take Donald Trump very seriously and you need to report on him rigorously, but we also have to find a way to keep a cool head. And, we know Donald Trump is a news-making machine. He says a lot of things. And it's important not to get hysterical and to stay calm and stay grounded in reality. And that is a really, as you say, it's a very, very difficult call to make story by story. Yeah. But I think we have to keep aiming for not getting overheated, not getting hysterical. And I mean, yesterday's news cycle saw new tariffs and then backing
down. You can't keep up. No. Literally, you cannot write a story now, ladies and gentlemen, without it changing like half an hour later.
Yes.
So
yes, the key is,
should we just be tweeting?
No, I think we all have to take deep breaths, try to stay calm, try not to get hysterical, try to eat, try to sleep. I'm saying this to myself as much as others. Yeah. Like this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. If you were to keep up with Trump's every move, it would exhaust you, and I don't think it's in the public interest. So we have to find some balance between taking what he does and says seriously, because he's the leader of still the most powerful country in the world, or that's now contested, but we need to pay attention and report and do rigorous work without losing our minds.
Peter, so Tara says keep calm and carry on, as much as it's hard to do. Steve Bannon, who used to be very close to Trump and was in his former White House, talks about this strategic approach to literally just flood the zone. Mm-hmm. Like media can't keep up. You're doing stuff over here, and then they're not paying attention to you doing stuff over here. And him just wanting to be at the center of it all. One of the things we've been thinking about is, do we just report on stuff like actions, like when things are at DEFCON 5, instead of running around and giving attention to every little thing he does? At the Hub, only really devoting times to big moves he makes. What do you think, Peter? Should we be scrambling around, or should we be, picking and choosing more carefully when it comes to just unprecedented remarks from the President of the United States?
Well, I think you have to follow it, of course, because he is the President of the United States, and he does have the nuclear codes, and he is the Commander-in-Chief of the largest military force ever assembled in the history of civilization. So you do have to take it seriously, but I think there's a great deal of responsibility falls on the manner in which you report it. So you need to be careful not to report it hysterically.
Yes.
And politicians, in my view, need to be very careful not to react emotionally and try to build political credits by doing so, because this is too important for politics. This is where you need calm, reasoned approach where you don't react too quickly. And I think generally I wasn't real impressed with Premier Ford's nonsense this week, but generally, I think Canadian politicians, I think the federal approach has been good, and most of the premiers, their approaches have been good, where they can be responsible and firm without being overly provocative, because we don't need to escalate.
All the incentives, though, Peter, are for the politicians to, and Ford did this, invite these American broadcasters into their offices, talk about how they're standing up for Canada and that they're going to turn off the electricity. Like, it does well with voters. It's like crack. These Canadian politicians. We talked about Canadian politicians doing American news a few weeks ago. Now, times that by like 10. Every time I turn something on, MSNBC, NBC, CNN, Fox News, all these politicians are happily doing American news, I guess in an attempt to speak to Americans, but also to, big up themselves is what the kids would say, right, Producer Amal?
She just gave us a very funny look. Yeah. You guys are old.
She's from a younger generation. Anyway, Peter, is it not at a disadvantage? Like it is not within their political interest to do what you just said and to be more. Maybe it is for maybe trade relations and the larger negotiations, but the incentives are for them to return fire.
Yeah. Yeah, but you're returning fire at somebody who has a lot more firepower than you do. Mm-hmm. You need to be conscious of that. So you need to be, like I said, you need to be determined and resolute, but you also don't want to be escalating, and particularly for just political gain. I mean, in Doug Ford's case, he's just won an election. Like he doesn't need to do that in that case. But I think maybe the other thing we're missing is that there is like this void at the federal level. Like you shouldn't have. I think Ford is going down today to a meeting where he's supposed to be helping renegotiate NAFTA. He's a provincial premier. He has no business doing that. But that's up to the feds to actually explain that to him, because what we do need is this is a federal issue in terms of trade at that point, and those are the guys who should be leading, but I can't say they have been.
Okay, so as the Americans leave the international scene in many ways, there are other folks stepping in, and we're experiencing this personally here at the Hub. I call this section meddling from the Middle Kingdom. So 3 of us have received emails from the Chinese embassy, and I hope they hear this, where they're asking, and I assume other journalists are getting this here in Canada, to have private meetings with us at the embassy, spurred by our coverage of Canada-U.S. relations, what Peter was just talking about, where we would discuss our insightful perspectives and exchange views on recent hot topics, is the emails we've received from the Chinese embassy. You best believe that China is trying to step into the void and improve Canada-Chinese relations and maybe... I don't know. Get in where the Americans have left when it comes to Canada. I have had dealings with the Chinese embassy before. In my previous job at The Agenda, we had the Chinese ambassador on. They're very kind to you in their dealings. They say things like, your professionalism is very impressive. They're looking for... they're looking for inroads in Canadian media. They're looking often for soft interviews. I was asked things like, will you provide the questions? Because in our culture, the questions are given ahead of time. Obviously, didn't do that. But all this to say, this comes out of a National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians report a few years ago that says the People's Republic of China is interfering with Canadian media content via direct engagement with Canadian media executives and journalists. And I worry, Tara, I don't know if you've experienced this, I just want journalists to be aware of where these approaches come from. And, if they do have these engagements, by all means, meet with them and talk to them. But to, know the file and understand, what their aims are when it comes to their image in Canadian media and, where they want to get to. And the role you play in that as a facilitator of their goals. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely something to pay attention to. This is not a file that I've covered, and so it's one I'm really playing catch up on now. And Harrison, you've definitely helped me on that front.
I remember when we were producing together, you're like, yeah, I'm interested. I was bugging you to do more foreign affairs in China because it is an obsession of mine. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I haven't really covered a lot of foreign affairs in terms of geopolitics and stuff like that. But it's becoming clear now that as a Canadian journalist focused on Canadian politics, you really do have to engage in those stories. And so I think I'm playing a little bit of catch up. I would be interested how many other journalists have received those overtures. Let us know if you have.
Mm-hmm. Peter, what do you think? Should I go to the embassy in a few days?
Well, do whatever you want, but I was going to say, if you do, you should make sure you tell everybody you're doing it. I think that's the best way to, it's always that sort of transparency, I think, by journalistic organizations is very important. So if you're basically having your own little interview or editorial board type meeting, but you should also be clear that, what the terms are, whether it's on the record, off the record, deep background, some sort of discussion, whatever's talked about. And they should be, if they're not comfortable with that, well, you can negotiate those terms, but you need to be transparent with and honest with your readers. I think that's very, very important for journalists these days, particularly Tara's writing a whole book about trust issues for journalists.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's very important, given the, interference inquiry and all these things. Be upfront. Don't let it come out in a picture of me going in the back door of the Chinese embassy. They're like, look at this, it's this person. China came out after Carney won, and they said, they expressed hope that the new Canadian government would maintain, I love this, an objective and rational perception towards China and adopt a positive, pragmatic policy to improve bilateral relations. This is after we slapped massive tariffs on their EVs, steel and aluminum, and they've come back with $2.6 billion worth of tariffs on Canadian agricultural products, food, etc. So I'm not saying don't talk. There needs to be some form of engagement, but again, as the three of us always say, it should be informed. Don't go in without having information as to what the relationship looks like. The Guardian a few years ago... I was going to
suggest maybe you could ask them which party they're backing in the upcoming election.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have them be revealing as well. A Guardian investigation in 2018 said that they found an astonishing scope and ambition as it related to China's worldwide propaganda campaign. China's trying to reshape the global information environment with massive infusions of money, funding, paid for advertorials, sponsored journalistic coverage, and heavily massaged positive messages from boosters to exploit the vulnerabilities of the free press to its advantage. So I would just say, don't be one of those vulnerabilities. Okay, I've talked too much. We have a bouquet that Tara has to deliver, FedEx, to... I guess it's someone in the U.S., but it's talking about Canada. Can you give us a sense? It kind of touches on a story we talked about a few weeks ago.
Well, so it is tangentially related to the States, but it is a Canadian that is receiving the bouquet. That Canadian is Anita Lee, who, full disclosure, is also a friend. So listeners, keep that in mind. So Anita Lee is the founder of The Green Line, a Toronto local news outlet. And she published a really interesting piece on her Substack, theotherwave.substack.com. And this is in reference to a Columbia journalism review article that we discussed on the podcast a couple episodes back. So this was about Pierre Poilievre. The title was Bracing for Poilievre. And it was about the subsidies and the media's fear of those press subsidies being revoked if Poilievre got into office. Now, we complained a little bit about this article. And my view was it was very one-sided. It was just interviewing press that were supportive of the subsidies. As the three of us know very intimately, there are lots of press that are not supportive of those subsidies. We've all signed the Ottawa Declaration saying that these subsidies should not be continued. So what Anita did was she was apparently interviewed for the Columbia Journalism Review article. Her comments did not make it to the article. She published the transcribed Q&A of her interview with that reporter.
Which is a bold move. I wonder if she got permission.
Yeah, who knows? I don't know. I haven't spoken to Anita about this, but I found it fascinating because I think that one of the key jobs of a journalist, specifically in a polarized environment, is to complicate the dominant narrative. And this Q&A really does that. Anita has a very nuanced view on the subsidies, and some of the points that she makes were points that were missing from that article, like, we need consumers of news to vote with their dollars and their eyeballs, that there's one reason to object to the subsidies, aside from everything else, is it's a failing business model. It's not a sustainable business model. So she made some excellent points in that Q&A, and it was a nuanced view, and that was the view that was missing. And then it, of course, begs the question, why did it not make into the piece? But I like that there's a way now of responding to some of these pieces and getting more nuance, more kind of complication on the record. Well, so there we go.
Like it made me even more, I don't know, the word troubled is too much, but it made me more sad in that it told me that, before we were saying, maybe the reporter who initially reported this piece and just gave one side isn't aware of these other perspectives. But in some ways, this makes it worse, Tara, because it means that reached out to someone, found that perspective, said, oh, this is different from the others, and then actively chose not to feature it.
Yeah, I would like to hear from the Columbia Journalism Review on this.
Is it worse, Peter? I think, haven't you been in touch with the Columbia Review of Journalism about all this?
Well, I sent them an email asking them if they were open to a rebuttal, because the piece in question, let's remember, was billed as an analysis, and an analysis typically gives a pretty dispassionate breakdown of the points of view around an issue, right? Well, this was not. It was billed as an analysis, but it was obviously an opinion piece. So that, in that sense, I think it was. It's dishonest to portray it as an analysis. I did send them an email asking if they were open to a rebuttal, and I did not so much as get an acknowledgement of receipt of my email.
So impolite. I'll just add this one more point, and then I'm interested in your perspective, Tara. And I was texting you guys about this. It's like, again, we get back to language. We were talking about language a few weeks ago. Even the headline and you see the journalist questions in this Substack because she's giving her answers, so you're able as well to see the journalist questions. But what if it did switch over to a conservative government, asked the journalist, what are you bracing for? And even that term, if I'm a guest on a show or if I'm being interviewed, that's a powerful term. It's basically telling me that, there's turbulent waters ahead, that right now the waters are calm, they're good, they're great. This is the norm you should be happy with, business as usual. Business as usual being public subsidies for private media outlets. Everything's hunky-dory, things are great, but there's a storm a-brewing, and what are you how are you battening down the hatches? So I'm primed to give an answer around that.
Yes, and then you read Anita's responses, and again, they are nuanced, particularly with regards to the CBC. She says, I support a thriving CBC. I want to see the CBC survive. I support funding for the CBC, and CBC has made some missteps. This is the kind of views we would like to hear in the media, nuanced, thoughtful views. And again, when you contrast that with the reporter's questions, which are very pointed and very informed by one particular perspective, it makes it more of a contrast, I think.
Peter, when you're asked questions by journalists and you don't agree with the asking of the question, do you stop them in their tracks and call them out? Or are you a polite Canadian and do you nod your head and give them the answer they want?
I think I'm polite, but I will say I disagree with the premise of your question. I think when you go back like that, you say, generally, I would just sort of say, can we just back up a little bit here? Because I think there's something we need to talk about before we talk about this. And that isn't something I got from any media training, but I think it resets the conversation and is a polite way of letting them know I'm not doing this. I'm not going to play that game with you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to bring an end to this conversation. Thank you so much, guys. We've talked for quite a while, got through a few subjects. We will be back in 2 weeks for another episode of Full Press. We will see you then. Be well, everyone.